Hi, Misha here. And last time looked at the various ships kind of inspired by and contemporary with the Constitution refit class, or the Enterprise class. And this time we're going to look at the next step forward. The ships inspired by the great experiment, the Excelsior. So not quite as many this time, but still enough for its own video. And like last time, gonna kind of look at these more from a beta canon or head canon perspective, and just, musing and some fun. So we'll just drive right on in. Our first is, of course, the Excelsior herself, originally NX 2000, later NCC 2000 after a minor refit around 2287. And this really was the next big leap forward for a heavy cruiser, heavy starship to finally replace the venerable Constitution class. And of course, a lot of emphasis was placed on the warp engines, being able to go faster. It's called transwarp in Star Trek 3, and as I've said in many videos, some people say that transwarp failed. I don't think so. Just because Scotty tampered with the engines, surely they would have fixed it, or he would have told them. And the reason I think it really did push warp forward was because we have a new warp scale in use in the next generation. So this would be kind of the deciding factor to my mind for the new warp scale coming into vogue. Why not? And just because they called that transwarp in the late 23rd century doesn't mean it's the same transwarp we see in the Borg and all that. Transwarp is probably just a term for, faster warp, or, a new aspect, kind of like saying ultra or super or whatever. This is definitely a larger starship than the Constitution. It's about 465 to 470 meters long, depending on the exact variant. It has a crew of about 750. It has larger, probably more torpedo bays in the front, and it has rear launching as well. It has newer, more powerful phasers and shields, and is overall just a very potent ship. And this would be the mainstay of the fleet for half a century, and it would be in service for a century, which makes sense considering the upgradable nature of starships. In looking at registry numbers, there seem to have been kind of 3 major waves of construction of these, with several built in between. There's kind of the initial wave. Now, the original 2000 was built and was ready to go by 2284. But it seems like it was kind of kept for testing. After all, it was an advanced prototype. So it was probably kept around Earth or nearby testing for a few years, and it's not clear that the class immediately went into full production. It seems like it was becoming a standard by 2290. And so there were some produced in the 2500 registry range. And then the next batch seems to have been made in the 14,000 registry range. And then a third batch seems to have been made in the 38,000 up to 42,000 registry range. And then there are some outliers, some as high as like the Melbourne into the 64,000 range. And we know that they were still refurbishing and building these into the 2360s. And that they were still very much in service through the Dominion War period. Although by this point they probably were downgraded from heavy cruisers to medium cruisers, or even special frigates in the fleet. But they were a very advanced ship with many new systems designed. And yeah, so in a game setting, if you're talking TOS era, this would be the big battleship, or as it sometimes was called, the super starship. Just faster, more powerful, and more durable. Of course, if you're doing a next generation era, this would be more of a support frigate, still reasonably fast, warp 9, still reasonably powerful as far as torpedoes and phasers, an aging but still very relevant ship. And these were also popular with high-ranking admirals and whatnot to be used as kind of their personal transports. There's a certain venerable nature to the Excelsior that, while it wasn't the best, it was just so iconic. And this still would have been a frontline ship during the Cardassian Wars as well. But it wouldn't be the only one. Now, of course, next up we have the so-called Excelsior refit, or the Enterprise B. We know quite firmly this was launched in 2293, and it's still considered an Excelsior variant. It's very similar, but just a few major changes. We have these two large impulse engines added to the saucer, plus the two original smaller ones. And we have this flared out section added to the star drive with these protrusions around the deflector dish. And there are a few other minor changes, including, of course, a new bridge module. But those are the big ones. This was, of course, in the movie Generations. And we only see a couple of this retrofit or alternative variant pattern. The other major one being the USS Lakota in Deep Space Nine, which was an upgraded Excelsior with very modern weaponry, including quantum torpedoes. In the kind of beta canon, the final Excelsior variant, or in the series to be produced, was the USS Dallas, for what that's worth. Excuse me. Spec-wise, this is going to have maybe better, more powerful impulse because of the additional engines. I don't mind the additional ones on the saucer, but I kind of wish they had taken the original ones off or replaced them with a third of this pattern. Having two of one style and two of a different style kind of bugs me, just from an aesthetic point of view. But that's just me. And I don't mind the kind of fins around the star drive here. They look fine. I still kind of like the original look better, but they did these in the film, A, to give it a different look from the Excelsior, and B, so they could be torn off by the Nexus. But yeah, this seems to be a slightly more improved, maybe combat-oriented variant, a little bit more than the original Excelsior. It might be said that these contain additional sensors or shield generation. And of course, again, the extra impulse engines would be for better maneuverability and maybe higher sublight speeds. And this would be a full production Excelsior versus the original, which was considered a prototype. But either way, these vessels were in production and in service for a very long time, and would influence starship design and variants for the next half century or so. So with that, why don't we get into the Excelsior variants? And this is what's really great about the Eagle Moss collection, that they did 3 of the 5 Excelsior study models or concept models or prototypes. The only 2 they didn't do were essentially like the full production version, just without as much detail. And this is the 1/2 nacelle version they did, with a very unique saucer, if you want to call it that. It's more of a shovel. And it has a star drive, kind of very reminiscent of the Excelsior, but it's pushed much further forward. And we have a very flat cross section with nacelles that are quite similar to the Constitution refit, but a little more advanced with these spikes in the back. And then we have this big section back here, which could be for maybe a very generous shuttle bay or cargo. I don't know. It's a very flat ship. A very big little miniature, though. Big little miniature. And, yeah, the fact that it doesn't have a traditional saucer is quite interesting. It kind of gives it a distinctive look in the way it kind of has these wing structures here. Yeah, it's a different look. We know really nothing about any of these study models. We do see most of them on screen, like at Wolf 359 or in the junkyard scene at the Qualler depot, or some we might see in the background of the fleet for the tachyon grid. I believe this is the one that was jokingly marked USS Excelsior, which is great. In the real world, this would have come before the full version, but to me, it's kind of a transitional model because of the nacelles. Could have come before or after. Has a recessed or kind of an interesting bridge placement. Without knowing much about it, it'd be hard to place it as to what it would be. Could it be a combat ship? Possibly. It is very flat. Kind of reminds me of the Voyager in a way, if you think about it. What do you think? The angle of the saucer, like a prototype Voyager. Of course, we don't really know size or anything. But this could have been a long-range exploration craft. Or it could be more of a cargo ship. You know, transport. With the Excelsior herself kind of taking the role of heavy cruiser. This would have been probably a more specialized ship because of its unique shapes. It looks like it was made for a very specific purpose to kind of justify deviating from the standard Starfleet design. But I really like it. It's different, and different is good, and I'm really glad Eagle Moss gave us this. Next up, we have the kind of pizza cutter ship, or another lollipop ship. And of course, it's a 4 nacelle design. This is one of the earliest of the study models. That's why it's kind of more of a primitive shape. They basically said, let's do a 4 nacelle version, which was a pretty new concept in the 1980s. That's about as far as I think they got with this. It does have a bit of a, yeah, this one, kind of a bit of a deflector, I guess you could say, down here. Not much of one. And then kind of a modular section in the back. Very stretched out design. Very thin saucer. Perfectly round. Definitely more reminiscent of a Constitution saucer, although different. And again, the nacelles are like the first. They look like a in-between with these spikes too in the back, and they have kind of these forward-swept pylons. You can tell they were stretching it out, trying to go for the speed look. So we could say in universe, this looks like something that would have been maybe a replacement for the Constellation class, and a forerunner of, say, the Cheyenne class. So it looks like, yeah, engines were the main fixture. If you look at it, that's kind of, we have a relatively small saucer, we have a long but thin star drive. The engines seem to be the focus of this ship. So I would rate this as maybe a heavy frigate, a fast response vessel with redundancy in the engines, but maybe not the strongest or most heavily armed. It doesn't appear to have just oodles of armament, so maybe not the most offensively oriented. Maybe a fast response rescue assistance vehicle, something along those lines. It's neat, I like it, but it's probably my least favorite of the study models. It's also the smallest, but it is very long. I'll give it that. And our final study model, and maybe the most unique looking, certainly the largest physical one here. We have another 4 nacelle design. It too has kind of the round, flat saucer. We do have a little bit more of a pronounced deflector down here, but it's still very small, very perfectly round. And we do have more depth to the engineering hull this time. It's not just a flat hull. We have very similar engines, longer but more streamlined spikes on them. We have these 2 little winglets sticking out here that maybe could be used to attach something, or maybe just for equipment or ventilation. Don't know. And we still have kind of that wing structure of like the first one. This is more flattened out, like the first one. It is a combination of the first and the second study model, with its own elements besides. This is a odd looking ship. It would definitely be a special purpose. This looks like it could be more of a freight carrier, bulk carrier. It looks big and chunky, like it could carry a lot. Maybe even like a colony vessel, resupply vessel. Maybe analogous to the later Springfield class. And I would think in universe, since the Excelsior was really the first of its type, having Excelsior features, these would all be later specialized variants in universe. Of course, we really don't know registries or anything about these, because the only time we see them is just in background shots and very far away. Occasionally maybe on a display screen. But yeah, this is certainly the biggest one of these. And while number 2 kind of carries the speed thing, this kind of is going for the more powerful thing. That said, it is kind of chunky and clunky looking too, not as sleek as the final version. And like I said, there were 2 more study models. One of them was just what would become the Excelsior, and the 5th one was very similar to the other 2 engine designs. I guess it was not dissimilar enough that it warranted making its own Eagle Moss out of, which makes sense. Tooling costs money, and 3 is probably already more than anyone ever expected. And with that, let's move on to the final couple that we met in Deep Space Nine. Simple, kind of understated, but classic. The Centaur class is kind of a fan favorite, and I really like it too. We only see this one in Deep Space Nine, and based on its registry number, this was a later production. It could have been something introduced long ago, or one of the later types. And in my mind, this kind of resembles the Miranda style, but of the Excelsior style. So a medium cruiser, a configurable type, just a, workaday ship. It's quite long because of the way the nacelles hang back. But pretty simple saucer design. It does have some unique elements, and it does use kind of a Miranda style pod here. But otherwise, it's pretty much Excelsior parts, I guess you would say. Kit bash. Yeah, pretty neat ship, and one of the better Eagle Moss models too. It's one of the ones I'm really glad they did, because yeah, no one's really doing Centaurs. But yeah, to my mind, it's the Miranda in the series, the medium cruiser. So in a game setting, this would be the little ship that could. A medium level warship. Seems to be reasonably powerful with at least 2 forward photon torpedoes. Again, it has kind of a weapons pod. We really don't know anything about it, aside from just, it exists in universe. But yeah, I think it would just be a good patrol ship, workaday ship, fast battleship perhaps. Size-wise, not really sure, probably about 300 meters. Seemed to have a relatively small crew, maybe 300, 350 most. But it solidly fits into the Excelsior style, and yeah, does really well. And we go from the sleek and understated Centaur type, Centaur class, to this thing, the Curry type. We also see the USS Raging Queen. Sometimes this is called the Curry class, other times the Shelley class. And this is an unashamed, weird kit bash. Essentially an Excelsior saucer, Excelsior star drive, but then Constitution refit nacelles. So kind of old school. But much like with the Centaur, it has a relatively late registry. Both of the two we see do. That doesn't mean they were only produced late. It just means, yeah. Now, some beta Canon and people's speculation says these were kind of slapped together from parts for the Dominion War. Other sources say they have a large shuttle bay and are kind of used as a fighter carrier. Both of which could be very much true. But I'll also point out, to my mind, it has a little bit of a resemblance to an Oberth. Because of the, star drive hanging down looks like a pod. And then the saucer on top. Again, we really don't know what this does, but since we don't have a science ship kind of in the mix so far, I would almost make this to be our science variant of the Excelsior. And since it has the deflector so far forward, I don't know, kind of looks like a cutter, almost like a boat shape coming through. Since it does have Constitution warp nacelles, we would assume it's not quite as fast as the regular Excelsior. But we do know they were in service during the Dominion War. It's an odd ship. As I've said in other videos, I honestly think it would look better without the star drive tacked on. Then it would just look like an Excelsior saucer with the pylons hanging down and then Constitution engines. Therefore, kind of like a slightly updated Miranda. But then we have this big pod star drive that just Seems odd. So I think if I were doing it, this would be kind of the science ship or the censorship. I don't know, just for something fun to make it different. What do you think? Does it look like the Oberth at all to you, or am I crazy? Let me know. And with that, we can wrap up the 23rd century with the first generation made of constitutions from the first video. And then, of course, the second generation, which really definitely delved deep into the 24th century from the Excelsiors. Smaller batch, but still worth noting. And while we know the Excelsior and its refit quite well, and many probably recognize the Centaur, the studio models, the study models, are pretty uncommon. Not many models out there of the models, because models. And for better or worse, probably better, the Curry type isn't terribly seen. As I've said in the past, comparing the Curry and the Centaur is like good kit bash and less good kit bash. So let me know what you think. And I think next time we'll go back even further in time and visit the 22nd century. So just around the corner. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.